The further one travels, the less one knows. One way to interpret this passage from the Tao Te Ching is that it would be wise to stay in one place and look inward for wisdom. But it also points towards a reality of the modern world. A world where the global is enmeshed with the local. A world where you can fill your passport with stamps and still find more confusion than clarity. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. Pico Iyer has spent the last half-century in motion. As a travel journalist and author, he's lived in Japan, dropped in on Iran, and visited the monasteries and megacities of the world. The fear for most, and hope for some, was that globalization would give birth to a monoculture, a world of nation-states all watching the same movies, listening to the same music, and drinking the same coffee. Iyer moves from place to place, seeking telltale signs that this global sameness never took hold. He is what we might call a sojourner of the planetary, someone who navigates nested perspectives of affiliation and sovereignty, not to transcend them, but to delight in them. This is what Iyer calls the half-known life. It's a life lived between cultures, between movement and meditation, between the illusion of certainty and the quiet clarity of humility. In an age defined by acceleration, Iyer offers a counterpoint. For years, he's made a habit of disappearing to a monastery in Big Sur, where he sits in silence among Benedictine monks, unplugged from the noise of the past, clamoring for the future. Not as a withdrawal, but as a return to attention. It's in these long retreats that Iyer reflects, writes, and reorients himself in an uncertain world. In this episode, he joins Berggruen Institute's co-founder Nathan Gardels to talk about travel, stillness, and the wisdom of knowing less. And now, Pico Iyer and Nathan Gardels on Futurology.
First, I want to start with your name. Your full name.
Yes.
Your full name is Siddharth Pico Iyer.
Yes.
And I'm wondering where that name comes from, because I remember your father was a friend of the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
And he moved to California.
Yes.
To engage in the reasoned dialogues at the Center for Study Democratic Institutions.
Yes.
And were you actually born there, or you were born in India?
I was born in Oxford, England.
Okay.
Where both my parents were teaching.
Okay.
And so the reason for the name is...
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Yes. Yeah. Both my parents were philosophers, masters of comparative religion, and having grown up in British India, absolutely conversant with Christianity as well as Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Judaism as well. So they actually gave me this perfect name for the global era.
Yeah.
So the first name, Siddharth, of course, the name of the Buddha.
Yeah.
Pico, after Pico della Mirandola, the 15th century Renaissance heretic, who read the Kabbalah and was a Christian mystic.
Right.
Berggruen was my father's name, and he was a theosophist. And Iyer is a very classic South Indian Hindu name. So they covered 4 religious traditions in one name. And the Pico part is especially good because, like my complexion, it allows me to fit in everywhere. Everyone can spell it, everyone can say it, and most people assume it is Italian or Spanish or Portuguese. So they equip me for the world to come much better than anyone might have guessed.
So they imprinted that already on your consciousness.
Yes.
By the name they gave you.
Exactly, yes. Even though we were living in a little flat in Oxford, England, which was not an international place in 1957.
So if I were writing your biography, I would call it Sojourner of the Planet.
Thank you.
And you are a singular writer in the sense that you travel both outward. The Spanish phrase is pata de perros, like dog, restless dog, dog feet, you got to keep moving.
Yes.
Patas de perros on one hand, and on the other hand, this kind of inward journey.
Yes.
So your early books, when we first met all those years ago, were Video Night in Kathmandu, about the reach of American mass culture.
Yes.
And then Global Soul, I'm not sure if that came before or after, but about airport complexes.
Yes.
I think you lived in airports.
I did.
Around
Yes.
the world.
Yes.
It was like the ascent of globalization, you know, and that was the mark. And then your latest book is A Flame, which is largely about your monastery experience in Big Sur. So the question, I suppose, is what was the impulse that led you to take these two divergent paths? What kind of wisdoms have you drawn from that? And what comes to mind is obviously the Buddha saying the path is the goal.
Well, I remember as a little boy, I thought there were two imperatives. One is to get to know the world, and one is to get to know the self that's seeing the world. And that I felt if I was in constant movement, I could never step back to see the larger picture and put things into perspective. But if I was spending all my time in the monastery, I'd be too far from the shifting global realities of the planet. And I've always felt that travel is only as good as the stillness that underwrites it. But just as you say, quite specifically and deliberately, my first 5 books were about moving at high speed around the world. And I brought out that book, The Global Soul, literally the first month of the new millennium, because I felt that was the reality the 21st century was entering. And halfway through that book, I do switch from the outer world to the inner. And then the next 5 books were more or less about the inner world, about the Dalai Lama, about memory, about stillness. And then in recent books, I've been trying to bring them together. First, in the one called The Half-Known Life, I'm traveling around 10 countries, but it's really about cutting through projections of paradise. And the second book, or the most recent one, as you said, A Flame, 100 retreats with Benedictine monks, but understanding that time spent in quiet is only as useful as how much you can bring it back into the world. And it's a means to the end of more fruitful and constructive action in the middle of Beverly Hills or Times Square or wherever it might be. And so I think the travel I see almost as akin to going to a farmer's market and gathering spices and herbs and vegetables, which you can only turn into a meal when you go back to the stillness of your kitchen. And in stillness, that's how I process experience, turn sights, I hope, into insights, and convert experience into meaning. Ideally. I think one reason I've been traveling more recently, and I'm sure we'll come to this, is my prejudice or perception that actually in the age of information, we know less than ever before about the rest of the world. And we know least of all about the countries we hear most about, such as Iran or North Korea or Cuba. Right. We know a little bit about their governments and their faltering economies and nuclear policies, but painfully little about day-to-day life and regular people. So I try to take myself out to see those places because I don't want to get them through a screen in 2 dimensions, lacking humanity and texture. But it's interesting, sometimes people will say, oh, you travel a lot. And that's because because I think you do the same thing. I will, let's say, go to Iran for 2 weeks, and then I'll come back home and sit at my desk for 2 months to make sense of it. And if I write an article, the reader will only see the 20% that's the exciting movement and not the 80% that's trying to put it into perspective. But I don't think you can do one without the other. It almost feels to me like breathing in and breathing out.
Yeah. It's like there's a Korean-German philosopher, Byung-Chul Han,
yes,
who writes about vida activa is empty without vida contemplativa.
Yes, exactly.
It means in a more Western sense, contemplation, not so much the Eastern sense, but it's the same sensibility. So in these travels, we're looking at the inner world and the outer world and trying to, in effect, maybe synthesize it, especially in a world where, as you just mentioned, the information age is becoming the age of non-communication. So how has that world changed or not changed over, it's been, 40 years? You've been traveling more or less around almost half a century.
Yes.
You go around the world, inward and outward. How has the world changed or not? And what I'm thinking of when I say that is a phrase from Haruki Murakami, the Japanese novelist, that Japan is, in his mind, borrowed surfaces from the Western modernization. It appears very Western from the outside. If you were traveling, stopping in Japan, that dimension looks very Western. But when you live there, on a day-to-day basis, the still old Japan is there.
Yes.
Culture is like the deep strata.
Yeah.
Do you see that not just in Japan, but I'd like to know actually, because you live in Japan, what
Yes.
that means maybe concretely, but in Turkey and Iran, obviously Russia, China,
Yes.
the borrowed services are there.
Yes. I mean, I have much too much to say to that, especially having based myself for 37 years in Japan. And I would begin by saying I don't think we're living in a small world. And I'm sure you know that from your own constant travels. And I think the differences and distances between us are greater than ever. Partly because of the illusion of smallness and closeness. So, for example, I will go to North Korea and hear that Kim Jong-il's favorite movies are James Bond movies. That makes him no more sympathetic to London. I'll walk around Iran and see that the pirated book on sale in every shop window is Walter Isaacson's brilliant biography of Steve Jobs. That makes Tehran no more sympathetic to Washington. And it's as if, I think, all of us are watching the same movies, but we come out of them having seen a completely different film. You know, Barbie was the big hit of 18 months ago. As you know, see Barbie in China and it has a radically different meaning from here in Los Angeles. And then see it in Baghdad and it has still another meaning. So
What might it mean, it's not interrupted, what might it mean in China or Baghdad? How might it see me different? Western materialism?
It might be some of that, and the position of women in society is radically different.
Yeah.
It might be a vision of exactly what they don't want to be moving towards in their world, especially in Iraq, I would think.
Yeah.
And we'll probably come to that. I remember when I met you in Davos 20 years ago, I wrote a piece partly for Davos saying that the big conflict in the world was between the old cultures and the young cultures, which we will get to in a second. But to go back to your initial question, I mean, I'll come to Japan in a minute, but you were asking me how the world has changed in 40 years. And in some ways, the dissolving of borders and the mingling of cultures has proceeded much more speedily than ever I would have imagined when I wrote Kathmandu in 1986. And
I just want to interrupt you on that one.
Yes.
That book, if I remember, was about everyone in the village gathering to watch a VHS video of Michael Jackson dancing or something, right?
in remote Nepal.
Yeah, in remote
Exactly.
Nepal.
Yes.
They all gathered at one
Yes.
TV screen with the VHS,
Yes.
and that was it.
That was the cutting edge technology in 1986. And I think it was essentially about the West projecting its dreams or illusions upon the East and the East doing the same in reverse. So many of us from, let's say, California would go to a country like Nepal in search of ancientness and wisdom and depth. And of course, all the Nepalis we meet are longing to be in Santa Monica or New York because they're hungering, understandably, for affluence and modernity and material plenty. And so it was really about the dance of dreams. But I announced, I guess, in that book in 86 that the American century is over and the Pacific century had begun. But when I described, for example, how the Japanese were beginning to defeat the Americans in baseball, I never could have guessed that now the Japanese are rewriting the history books in baseball with Ichiro and Otani. I was writing about how Bollywood was taking its cues from Hollywood. I never would have guessed that now we see it happening in reverse. And I think the biggest historical development in my lifetime, which you've witnessed too, is the transformation of China. Yeah. So when I was there in 1985, no cars on the main drag leading to Tiananmen Square, all the people wearing Mao jackets, people playing badminton in the middle of the main drag. And now it makes New York look 40 years out of date. So at that level it's changed. And the other way I think it's really changed is that book was about cultures fascinated by each other and the values they projected on the other. But now it's all happening internally because 450 million people soon will have several cultures inside them. And East and West are mingling and creating new combinations within them. So that so-called clash of civilizations has gone inward. And I think that's the story of the new century, whether it's Barack Obama or Naomi Osaka or Malcolm Gladwell or Zadie Smith, all the old black and white distinctions are being dissolved. I love that quote about borrowed surfaces because I do think even the thrust of that first book in the 1980s was that old deep cultures like China and India and Japan can take all the hamburgers and Hollywood movies they want without really changing deep down. And they're savvy enough to take what they need or what fascinates them from the West without being transformed by them. In the same way, even here in California, you and I could well drive in our Japanese car to the yoga studio and then to the Thai restaurant and then have some burritos, and we're still as American and unglobal as we ever were. But even more so for those old cultures. And so you're absolutely right. When I first went to Japan, as with many people, this was 1983, what hit me instantly was the all-American shopping arcades and the fact that McDonald's is more popular there than here, and that little Japanese kids are shocked when their mothers tell them that baseball isn't a Japanese sport. But the longer I've been there, the more I see how much it's rooted in Shinto and its 15 things from 1500 years ago. And I almost feel it's constantly changing on the surface so as not to change deep down. And we see that, take the Middle East. If you're in Palestine, the kids in Israel and the kids on the other side of the wall are wearing sneakers and T-shirts and jeans, and that doesn't begin to bring them together. And I think that's the state of the whole world. It used to be said that England and America were two cultures divided by a common language. And now I think the world or the planet is 200 cultures divided by a common kind of pop cultural lexicon. We're all sharing the same things, but each culture takes Oppenheimer or whatever, Game of Thrones, whatever is the thing of the moment, and translates it not just into its own language, but its own context and history and tradition. And so even, let's say, a Norwegian and a Pakistani are both speaking English together, but I feel they're as mutually incomprehensible as if they were speaking Norwegian and Urdu. In that sense, you know as well as I, probably better than I, how the world is not coming together.
Yeah. It seems what emerging is both kind of a mesh and a clash at different levels.
Yes.
And it's interesting that the theory was that the more prosperous the world came through modernization on the Western model, the more it'd be like the West. In fact, it's the opposite. The more prosperous nations become, particularly look at China, the more they return to their roots to shape their future. So it seems that the contradiction that is now apparent and that you're just expressing is that politics and culture are about emotion, identity, and cultivating ways of life among one's own kind. Technology and economics are universalizing and rationalizing. And when those two forces meet, they clash. They don't march in lockstep. So that has given rise, or re-rise really, to the idea of a clash of civilizations. So these days, as you know, the Chinese and the Russians and Iran refer to themselves as civilizational states, and even now, kind of in turn, when one's incommensurate values are asserted, it reaffirms the values of others. So now you see in the West, you see Giorgia Meloni, you see Viktor Orban, you see Elon Musk talking about Western civilization. Giorgia Meloni talks about Western civilization is Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian humanism. So it's kind of this mirror process taking place where assertion of one recreates assertion of others, so you kind of have this clash. Do you see that going on? I mean, maybe not in the narrow sense that Sam Huntington put it, but do you see this clash at a civilizational level, or is that too one-dimensional?
I love what you just said, and this is why I love reading your editorials. I mean, so brilliant and deep, and what you said in the beginning about the technology and the ways in which we're coming together and apart. Yes, certainly I see it as a clash of civilizations, though different civilizations clashing than when Samuel Huntington formulated that. And as I say, at the turn of the century, I felt one of the anomalies of our modern age then was that the strongest power in the world was the youngest power. And the strongest power in the world, the US, was the one perhaps least interested in the rest of the world. And I felt that the older cultures, whether China or Iran or Iraq or elsewhere, to some degree envied and wanted a part of this teenagers optimism and energy and dynamism, but looked a little askance when the kid assumed that it knew more than these elder cultures. And so in some ways it's a dynamic you see in every family where the teenager's on the go, but the grandfather doesn't want to take lessons from the teenager. And that, I think, persists to this day. Mm-hmm. You and I share a great admiration for Orhan Pamuk, who lives literally where the East meets the West. I mean, his study looks over the bridge that links Europe to Asia. And that's his great theme, of course. And I think in his book of essays, Other Colors, he actually says, when even an intelligent person speaks about the clash of civilizations, he starts spouting nonsense. So I should be wary of that. I have long said, and it may no longer be true, that nationalism is on the rise because it's on the run. That collectively, as you say, we see more and more authoritarianism and more people trying to create walls, precisely because they see that other borders are dissolving and the world is moving in one direction. I learned from your magazine, New Perspectives Quarterly, many years ago that a 14th century Arab thinker, I believe, said, if humans are in a desert, their first impulse is to create a wall. We need to form ourselves into tribes, and we can only define a we by creating a them. So I think one way or another that will always happen. But I think what we're seeing across the world right now is that, as you say, people are unsettled by the fact that all the ways they define themselves are collapsing. And so they're trying to create new linear demarcations. Yep. But as you and I are talking, this very minute, a Swedish woman and a Nigerian man are falling in love, and a Thai woman and a German man are getting married. And the children who come out of those unions aren't going to belong to either East or West or North or South, or aren't going to fit into those definitions. And the number of such people who belong to many places at once, even a little as I do, is growing so quickly. And is only going to continue growing exponentially. So I think the nationalists are fighting a lost battle, essentially. And that's what's so fascinating now, much more than when you and I first met. If you look at our sports stars, our celebrities, and our leaders, they don't fit in tidy definitions. When I first met you, I never expected that a half Kenyan man would be president of the US in my lifetime. I never expected someone who looked like me would be prime minister of Britain. And so whatever is happening, and however people are trying to keep that at bay, it's like trying to keep a tsunami at bay. And I think, as I said, there are maybe 450 million people now who belong to this tribe of the many-homed. So that's already the third largest nation in the world, and it's increasing more quickly than India or China.
Yeah, you mentioned Orhan Pamuk,
yes.
And before you mentioned, beautifully put, the clash of civilizations within has gone from without to within.
Yes.
Pamuk talks about the two souls of Turkey.
Yes.
When you're speaking of Turkey. In which you have some that want a theocratic society and dominate everything, some want a secular society, when the reality is that nations, just like individuals, have two souls.
Yes, and I think his other point is that two souls are better than one.
Yeah, exactly.
And
two souls are the dialogue within ourselves and within our own generative or our own generation as human beings. Yeah.
Yes, and for example, I think of where we began this conversation. So my parents grew up in British India, and I grew up in Britain. And so they grew up with absolute command of English literature, English history, the Bible, and everything that they knew growing up of India. Yeah. Much better equipped than I. And they know more about British literature and British history than I did growing up in England with a uniculture. And I'm also thinking, I think both you and I married somebody from essentially a different culture.
Yeah.
And so our children are living examples of what I'm describing. And I never imagined that London, which is such a grey, dull, dead city when I was growing up, would become so young, so vibrant, and so cool, partly because the average person you meet on the streets currently was born in a foreign country, as with Toronto. Yeah. And so it's made our lives so much more exciting than they were. And your children can't be pushed into a box.
And I guess the question of which we don't know the answer is both of these things are pushing at each other. I mean, this new reality of Jose Vasconcelos, a Mexican education minister at the time of the revolution, called La Raza Cosmica.
Yes. I learned that from you too.
La
I
Raza
remember,
Cosmica,
yes.
that someday this would mix. Now that is, at this very moment, in great conflict with the return of the strong gods, so to speak, which is faith, family, and nation. And we've talked about the conflicts within Iran or China or whatever, but you also have within Western civilization. So some years ago, I wrote about the Pope versus Madonna.
Yes.
Meaning Pope John Paul at the time, John Paul II at the time, and Madonna was doing a bunch of performances at the steps of the Vatican to kind of like diss Catholicism, right? So Pope versus Madonna. So now you had this liberal, open culture, open society culture, and now there's a pushback against it.
Yes.
What the conservatives call the strong gods. So it's a battle, and one hopes that a synthesis comes out in the end, two souls.
Yes.
But it's currently definitely the opposite direction of where things have been moving.
Yes, no question.
Yeah.
But a part of me thinks that when you and I first met, one center of the world was a place like Singapore. And now I'd say one center of the world is a place like Dubai.
Yeah.
But in both cases, their strength comes from the fact that they're drawing people from everywhere.
Yeah.
And pushing forwards in a way that the more unicultural places are not. I'm also thinking of Murakami. To go back to what you were saying about borrowed surfaces, he's a perfect example of that. And so Haruki Murakami is globally popular because he's writing about global suburbia where people are probably screening Queen's Gambit and eating pasta and listening to Miles Davis.
Right.
But it's, as I say, as you've been saying, beneath all that, we're no closer than we ever were, and his work shows that. It speaks to everyone around the world, but it doesn't really satisfy because there's nothing sustaining beneath those borrowed surfaces.
That kind of leads me to my next question, which is taking to another realm, so to speak, science and spirituality. Meaning, in one sense, Octavio Paz, the Mexican Nobel poet, used to talk about how the West meets East at the end of history. And he thought that the precepts of Eastern philosophy were being recognized in the West, particularly with developments in science like quantum physics, in the sense that quantum physics is about, like Buddhism in a sense, there's an emptiness. They're not solid entities. The person, the ego, is not a solid entity. It's a conjunction of time and space, a conjunction of cosmos, of other people, of nature. And only the relations constitute that moment of being. There's no essential being other than that relatedness. So it's kind of that concept of emptiness. He thought that the quantum science, which is that, there's moments of stability in which forces come together. A wonderful phrase by Carlo Rovelli, the Italian quantum physicist, that existence is only a momentary get together on the sand.
That's lovely.
And so Paz thought that this combination of advances in science plus the old spirituality was somehow leading to a new kind of consciousness. Now I know that the Dalai Lama has talked about science and spirituality. Krishnamurti had conversations with David Rome, the quantum physicist. Do you, in your investigations and knowing the Dalai Lama, do you see any of this emerging, or when the Dalai Lama talks about science and spirituality, what does he mean?
So it's interesting as I hear you speak, how the Dalai Lama, as you probably know, has made all his Tibetan monks learn Western science. At the same time as in schools in Minnesota now they're teaching mindfulness. And I think the Dalai Lama's point, which I have heard him make often, is that he feels that the Tibetans, living in such isolation for so many centuries behind the highest mountains on earth, had an advantage when it came to, let's say, developing meditation and contemplative practices. But he feels that the West has always been much better at material science. And so he's been so excited that as the first global Dalai Lama, he can learn from Western science and bring it back to his people. And you're right, there are similarities, and he's written books about the similarities between quantum physics and Buddhist thinking, in the sense that everything is impermanent and is constantly shifting, which you see in the works of Proust even. And I think most wise people, Marcus Aurelius too, have probably sensed the same. And it's interesting also to think about that in relation to what you were just talking about with strong gods, because a part of me feels that the more we're living in a state of fluidity, the more some people are trying to impose rigidity, as trying to keep it at bay, I think quixotically. But the Dalai Lama, because as you say, I've known him for 50 years and I travel with him a lot, his basic mission, as part of this new planetary order, is to find what is universal. And so he loves science because the law of gravity can't be argued with. It lives beyond the clash of civilizations. It's not particular to any way of thinking. And I think he sometimes says he puts his faith in three things: common sense, common experience, and science. So even as a Buddhist, as you know, when he comes to this country, he tells people, please don't become Buddhists. You'll probably be grabbing the wrong part of it, or maybe too drawn by the fact that you don't know this culture as well as you know your own. But you're right. It's striking that a religious teacher would be putting such emphasis on science, but it's because reason and logic are really what he values before anything in reality. A clear examination of reality is probably the best definition of what the Dalai Lama sees his mission to be, and therefore he bows before the scientists who do that.
I want to come back to that point, because a term you use often in your books, particularly the book, The Half-Known World.
I always keep calling it the half-known world. It's actually the half-known life, but I make that same mistake myself.
You've been saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Is this idea of de-deludedness.
Yes.
But before we get there,
Yes.
I want to ask you, you talk about the Dalai Lama. You also done profiles of Leonard Cohen.
Yes.
So here's this kind of carousing bard.
Yes.
And His Holiness sitting up there near Tibet, meditating. What is the connection? What led you to look at these two characters as a subject to write about, and what is the correspondence between them in your view, their experience?
To begin with, they're both very serious Buddhist monks, albeit walking in the opposite direction. It goes right back to your first question. So the Dalai Lama has been a monk since the age of 4, but such is the nature of his duty, he spends almost all his time in the world, in the European Parliament, visiting the White House, on the streets of New York City. He's never really been able to sequester himself in a monastery or on the top of a mountain. So he's a monk whose whole life has taken place in the world. And Leonard Cohen is a worldly soul who chose to become a monk and to go exactly in the opposite direction and live for 5.5 years on the high, cold, dark mountains behind us in Mount Baldy, and told me when I first met him at 61, as he was going through his 7 days and 7 nights of meditation in midwinter, this is the profound and delicious and fascinating experience in life. This is the great adventure of life. And this from a man who, as you say, could have been doing anything and with anyone and had tasted all the pleasures of the world and found inner contemplation to be the most exhilarating. So there's a lot. You call him a carousing bard, but I think of him as this black-robed meditator. And when I took my Japanese wife up to Mount Baldy and she stepped into the meditation hall, she didn't know anything about Leonard Cohen. And she saw 30 monks assembled there, and she assumed he was the abbot. because he was sitting with such perfect form, exactly like what she sees in the Zen temples around her home in Kyoto. She thought, oh, this is the man who's running the community, until he invited us for coffee in his cabin, and he handed her a cigarette with such languid cool that she started shaking at the knees, and she realized this is not a monk of the kind I'm used to. But I feel that he was a monk at heart. I mean, he's a grandson of rabbis on both sides, and essentially the spiritual life was the center of his commitment from early days. But unlike the Dalai Lama, he had the luxury of being able to go and be in retreat for 5.5 years. And as in some parable, as you know, when he came down from the mountain and he found that somebody had made off with all his money, and he had to go on the road at the age of 73, giving 380 concerts in his late 70s, and suddenly becoming more cherished and popular than ever before. I think it was partly because he was turning the great concert halls of the world into a kind of meditation hall. So when people saw him on stage, they didn't feel he was a performer trying to sell them on himself or on his work. They felt they were seeing a monk, and he was bringing all the passion and intimacy and depth of monastic practice to the world of popular music, which is startling. And as you probably remember, he would kneel before his performers, and he would talk about prayer, and you really felt that this was somebody who was just eavesdropping on us, but basically lived on top of a mountain with the other monks. So they have a lot in common. And I first became interested in monks because I was just thinking about this. If there's a problem with my Toyota, I'll take it to the Toyota service center. And if my laptop's not working, I'll go to the Apple store. And in my life, if there are things I can't figure out, I felt I would seek out monks because they were the ones who knew how to live. And then I started spending time with monks, and I realized actually they were teaching me how to love. And then I spent more time with them, and I realized they were teaching me how to die in some ways. The Dalai Lama thinks about death in his morning meditations every day. Christian monks traditionally have that skull on their desk, reminding them you don't have all the time in the world. And then I also, as I lived with monks, saw that they were doing something even harder than learning how to die, which is learning how to tend to the dying and seeing all their brothers and the people around them dying, and how do you stand up to that challenge. So I think I've always gravitated to monastics, nuns as well. And that's probably how I found my way to Leonard Cohen, having already spent 15 years with the Dalai Lama.
Something I read that you wrote about Leonard Cohen, a quote from him, maybe, I think it was it's in the flame, I think, is there was a sense of renunciation.
Yes.
Not unlike the Buddha, so to speak.
Yes.
I mean, he was out there in the world. He was, like I said, he was the carousing bard.
Yes.
He had a big ego. He got a lot of attention. And somewhere in there, you have a quote of him saying basically, like, this is the most exciting thing that I've ever done.
Yes.
Not all of that.
Yes.
So I think that's a fascinating
yes, and as you say, he had so much to renounce because he'd been a celebrity and a beloved singer, songwriter, and poet for 30 years when he became a monk. And when I first visited him, and I pulled up into the parking lot, and this stooped figure in a tattered robe with a bobble cap and woolen glasses came out and bowed and insisted on carrying my bags into the cabin where I was staying and started cooking for me, I didn't even recognize it was my hero for 20 years, Leonard Cohen, because he turned himself into a kind of anonymous grunt. He was just living to serve others, shoveling snow, scrubbing floors, driving his aged teacher to the doctor. So he'd completely erased that being called Leonard Cohen. And when I would ask him questions about his career, he would look at me as if I was asking about what's the temperature like on Mars or something, as if, he'd exploded his career, which actually, as I was saying, made his career even stronger. And the other thing that was so moving about his renunciation was that, as you might expect, he was the most articulate writer I've ever met. He was a wizard with words, as you can tell from his songs and poems. So he could talk spellbindingly about the journey of the soul and politics and literature and his time in Cuba soon after the Bay of Pigs and his life in Greece and philosophers. And yet, when I visited him in his house the first time and subsequently, we had this very engaging conversational lunch. And at the end of the lunch, he picked up 2 folding chairs and he took them out to his tiny front garden looking out on a quiet residential street in a very unfancy part of LA, and looking out on this tidy bed of flowers. And I sat down next to him. He didn't say a word. Silence. More silence. More silence. And finally I thought, well, this is a gentle hint. And I said to him, oh, I'm sorry, you have much to do. I should leave you. He looked up at me beseechingly, please don't go. And I realized that this man of beautiful words was wise enough to see that the best thing he could share with somebody was silence. And that was the greatest expression of trust and friendship. And in fact, his Japanese teacher had given him the monastic name Jikan, which means the silence between two thoughts. And his favorite song among his many songs, and my favorite of his, is called If It Be Your Will, which is complete renunciation. It's a classic prayer that you would find in any tradition, in which he says, if it be your will, I will speak no more. I am spoken for. I will be silent. I'll give it all up. So that was humbling and remarkable to witness, and it made a big impression, as you say, because he had so much to give up, and he had given it up, and he found that he hadn't gained much from the accumulation of all those things, and he gained a lot as soon as he gave them up.
So one thing I think you also read in there about his submission,
yes,
basically,
yes,
to the clarity of existence, or the
yes,
de-deludedness,
yes,
like the Dalai Lama, deludedness, Shambhala in the Tibetan Buddhism. What delusions are being dispelled in this idea of de-deludedness and clarity, submission to gratitude, commitment to gratitude, submission?
It's a lovely question, Nathan. Thank you. The notion you're the center of the world, the notion that you're important. He didn't take himself or his work seriously. You said it before, ego. That's what he left down on the highway.
Yeah.
And not far from where we're sitting, I visited him on the day that happened to be his 107-year-old teacher's last day on earth. And he was the one, elegant, impeccable Leonard, who was sitting week after week in the hospital with his teacher. And he said to me, the whole point of this practice is cleaning my friend's diapers when he can't do it himself, taking him to the toilet. So he had renounced himself sufficiently to be a servant to everybody who visited. When you visited his house, as I say, in this pretty rough part of LA, he was always standing at the front door, outside the front door, kind of ready to serve. So even when he came down from the mountain, he'd left Leonard Cohen behind and out of the equation. It goes actually with what we were just talking about. I love your alighting on that word undeludedness, because just last week in a book by Mark Epstein called The Zen of Therapy, I read the Dalai Lama saying, selflessness is seeing things as they are. In other words, once you get yourself out of the picture, that's when you can really assess accurately the world. And again, not far from where we're sitting, Christopher Isherwood, who is similar to Leonard Cohen as an accomplished writer who submitted to his Eastern teacher for 40 years, said wonderfully, the ego is like that man who insists on standing in front of you at a horse race. In other words, you can't see anything because the ego is coming between you and the world. And once you let go of that, as I think Leonard did, he could see the world and he could see himself clearly. And I think the reason people love his music is you can tell it's about honesty and intimacy. And he's not claiming to wisdom and he's not claiming to purity. In fact, he's very naked about his sins and imperfections. And that's why they trust him.
So when one meditates or is mindful and sees the world clearly, what's left is the moment.
Yes, yes.
And not the past, not the future, the moment. So poets, like I mentioned several times, Paz or Czesław Miłosz,
yes,
are muses of the moment.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I have a phrase that I like to quote from Miłosz about mindfulness. Mindfulness occurs in the moment when time stops. And what is time? Time is our regrets, our shame. Time contains all things toward which we strive and from which we escape. In that moment of time stop, reality is liberated from suffering. Paz talks similarly about time resting in a pause, floating on the hour, a river stopped, the eternal moment. Is this the paradise within that the Rumian talks about, or that Leonard Cohen is trying to reach in that space of de-deludedness?
Beautiful. This is the moment to tell you, Nathan. I read that Milosz quote in something you wrote, and I stole it.
Yeah.
And when I was traveling with my book on silence, I thought no one is going to put it better than that, about time stopping is releasing or liberating reality from suffering.
Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful. And I've heard it said that the mind, especially the analytical mind, can do the past and it can do the future, but what it can't do is the moment. And Thomas Merton beautifully says there's a variation on this. When your mind is still, then suddenly the forest becomes magnificently real, which is another way of talking about renunciation and undeludedness. You're out of your head and you're in your senses and you're filled up with the world rather than what usually fills my head, which is my tax returns and my arguments with my editor and why is that guy cutting me off on the 101 freeway. Suddenly you're freed of that and you're full of something much larger. And I'm thinking about, as you know, I'm sure the Greeks had two words for time. One is chronos, which is the time of the calendar and the clock, and the other is kairos, which is sacred time, when we step out of time, when we forget the time, when we're in love, or at a moment of wonder, or a moment of terror, perhaps, or we step out onto a terrace in Tibet and we're transfixed, and suddenly those peak moments, as Maslow called it, take us out of time and make us feel we're in eternity, and that's often what so many of us are craving. And so we can only find eternity in the moment, not when we're, I think, thinking about past or present. And it goes back also to your first question, because I realized, because I was spending a lot of time in airports, the more time I spent in airports, the more I had to engage in cathedral time. So airport time is when the destination's clicking over, everyone's very conscious of the time, they're hustling, bustling on their way to somewhere. You can't afford to lose a moment, and you're very displaced in every way. And cathedral time is when you step into Notre Dame and you're surrounded by this huge darkness and you become tiny or almost disappear and the light is flooding through the windows and you're in the space described by the great poets like Milosz and Paz. And I thought, if I'm spending a lot of time in the airport, I need to spend a corresponding amount of time or more time in equivalent to cathedral.
Also the thing about the moment is it's fleeting.
Yeah.
As Octavio Paz says, it's all time and no time. It's a window into eternity. It's there and it's gone. Impermanence.
Yeah.
Now, you wrote after the fires in your house in Goleta, I guess your family house in Goleta near Santa Barbara, burned several years ago.
Yes.
And we've had in LA last January these devastating fires, leaving kind of a Hiroshima burnscape. And I remember in the earthquake in LA in 1994, I think it was, the house that you put together and crafted everything, made it perfect, was just, completely wrecked in no time. So this sense of impermanence, reality keeps teaching us that.
Yes.
What were your reflections? And you've written about this, I know, your reflections on your own experience in the fire in Goleta.
So I was just talking to somebody who lost her house, a young writer who lost her house in the fires in January in Los Angeles. And I was saying, on the evening of the fires, all I could see was loss. And as the months and years have gone on, I've seen how much liberation there was and how much actually losing everything in the world, speaking of renunciation, allowed me to do things I might have been too shy or scared to do otherwise. I lost all my notes, so I had to start writing fiction. I never would have taken that plunge otherwise. The insurance company came to me and offered to replace my possessions, and I realized this is my chance to live much more lightly, the way I've always wanted to live. I didn't need to replace 90% of the books and clothes and furniture I'd accumulated. So in so many ways, of course it's not true for everybody, but it opened doors for me as well as closing many, many doors. And when I think back on it, one of the things that surprises me is that because my job in those long ago days was to be a columnist for Time magazine, so I used to write the back page essay sometimes, and I just had this eyewitness view on what was then the worst fire in Californian history. So I was stuck in the middle of the fire for 3 hours, and when I finally was able to go out, in downtown. I went to an all-night supermarket. I bought the toothbrush, and then I went to a friend's house to sleep on the floor. But before I went to sleep, I asked my friend if I could use her computer to send in an article to my bosses at Time. And so in my article, 3 hours after escaping the fire, I described that day. But I ended it with a poem from Japan from the 17th century, because I'd been spending time in Japan already, from somebody, it was little known then, I think it's better known now, but written by somebody called Masahide, who said, "My house burnt down. I can now see better the rising moon." So something in me, much wiser than I am, on the very evening I lost everything, saw that not everything was lost and that something might be gained. And I thought about this a lot during the pandemic. I would have a much keener sense of priorities and what I loved after the fire than before. And I think many of us during the pandemic, stripped of our usual routine and opportunities, suddenly found that everything essential rose to the top. We were closer to our friends, we were closer to our family, we were thinking more about what we had to be grateful for. We were not taking for granted the fact that at the end of the day we were alive. Also, I was saved in that fire by a good Samaritan. And so coming so close to losing my life made it much easier to lose my possessions. In some ways, I came out of that evening ahead, because the miracle of a man with a water truck who was stranded at the bottom of our driveway and saving his life saved mine too. And then, as you know, I wrote this book called A Flame, and it's about the question we're all facing, which is how keep the inner flames of confidence and conviction and hope alive when the external flames are rewriting our lives every day. Because these fires are found from Greece to Australia to Hawaii, and if it's not fire, as you suggested, it's earthquake or tsunami or flood or something or other, plague even. And I think we're all addressing that question of how to remain calm in a world of mounting uncertainty and how to remain hopeful in the face of impermanence. I'm lucky to live in Japan because they're masters of impermanence. As you know, they've constructed a whole society around it. 100 years ago in Tokyo, buildings were constructed to last for only 3 years because it was assumed that they would burn to the ground within 3 years, those old wooden buildings in a society filled with fire. A friend of mine just said, they're called cherry blossom buildings. And you cherish them precisely because you don't think they're going to last very long. Yes. I just encountered in Jung his saying, the difference between a good life and a bad life is how you walk through the fire. Which at some level, if you take fire to be a metaphor, is something all of us recognize. And you mentioned I love the Stoics, and they, like the Buddha and like Milton and Shakespeare and so many others, point out our lives are determined not by what happens to us, but by what we do with what happens to us. So the sad reality of right now is so many people lose their houses and lose everything they thought was secure through some natural disaster. But in the aftermath, people respond, of course, in very different ways. And that's how we make our lives, in the response to the tragedy rather than the tragedy itself.
Do you find Japan more foreign now, after living there 40 years, than when you first began to live there?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Equally foreign, but at this point I know it's always going to be foreign. After 37 years, I don't expect it to reveal its secrets to me. But that's part of the lure of being there for me, because I think what all of us are looking for in our relationships or our careers or our homes is that mix of foreign and familiar. Because the foreignness is what keeps the mind intrigued and excited and stimulated. And the familiar is what keeps the heart soothed and at peace. And I think one needs both of those. So Japan is a bit like an exotic England. An unfathomable version of the place where I grew up. But it also, in some mysterious way, does feel very familiar.
Let me ask you two questions about your vocation as a writer.
Yes.
As a travel writer.
Yes.
So it's been said that the further you travel, the less you know.
I love
Would
that.
you say that?
I do.
Half-known life.
Exactly.
Yes.
And also what we were just saying about Japan. So when I first arrived in Japan, I spent 2 weeks there, and I wrote a 40-page chapter in my first book. After 37 years, I can barely manage a haiku. I know how much lives outside my comprehension, and I love that. Because I remember, I think like many of us, when I was a kid, I was a know-it-all. I felt I was, master of the universe sitting on top. I knew what I was going to do with my life, and I would summarize Japan after a 2-week trip. And the older I've gotten, the more I see I don't know a thing, and I'm really glad to be that, and to be more of a servant of the universe, and to be humbled by experience. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's a scary situation in some ways, but it's a realistic one too. So the further you travel in life, I think the less you know. And so at this point, I feel almost as if I'm living in a little lighted tent up in the Himalayas, and there may be a lantern in the tent, and I'm surrounded by vast darkness. And that's not a bad place to be, rather than the illusion. I think the illusion of knowledge is worse than ignorance, which is why I worry that we know less than our grandparents did about the rest of the world. If you asked my grandmother and grandfather, let's say about Iran, they would maybe have got something from a novel or an encyclopedia, but wouldn't really assume they know very much. If I ask my friends in Santa Barbara at Iran, they'll tell me everything they got from CNN and the New York Times, and I think that's taking them away from a knowledge of Iran. And of course, that's been the problem with our engagement in Afghanistan and other places, the assumption we know. So I'm glad to embrace unknowing.
Would you say that looking back on your experience, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Buddha saying the path is the goal, or in Taoism, the way, unfolding way?
Yes. Well, I like the unfolding part.
Yeah.
I think probably I had a stronger sense when I was a kid of things being cut and dried and completion.
Yeah.
And now I think nothing is ever resolved, and I'm happy to live in that unfoldingness, I guess.
Then the final thing I would say about your vocation is when I write your biography called The Sojourner of the Planet, that I think, again, it was Byung-Chul Han, the Korean German philosopher, who says that the role of the writer is to dismantle the notion of otherness.
100%. Yes. And that's why we read, too.
Yeah.
I will read a book by a young, gay female writer, and the beauty of it is I'm in her skin, I'm in her eyes, and I'm seeing what she has that makes absolute sense to me. Yeah. And certainly that's the writer's job, and in a world ever more divided and ever more urgent thing. So I feel a writer's job is to inhabit people radically different from himself, so as to see the world through their eyes and try to bring it back to others. And so as also to see that your hopes are mine and my hurts are yours. Because the world is ever more divided, I feel a writer or an artist's job, perhaps, is to try to find the places on the far side of our division. And that's why I completed this book of Flame about silence, because I feel so often it's our words and our beliefs that cut us up. If you and I start talking about our beliefs, though we agree on so much, we'll probably be at some point at odds. Yeah. But if we share a moment of silence, we're brought to something much deeper than our ideologies or our thoughts, where I think we're connected. And so I like the fact that silence is non-denominational. And as you know, in my last book, I wrote at the center of the book was the conundrum of Jerusalem. And the city of faith is a city of conflict. And what always strikes me about Jerusalem is it has such a magnetism. Sometimes I'll be walking down the street in California and I'll be pulled towards Jerusalem, even though I'm not Christian or Jewish or Muslim. And I'm moved to tears by some of what I see in Jerusalem. And yet the tragedy of Jerusalem for 3,000 years is your view of heaven is not mine. And people, even within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the 6 Christian orders start hitting each other with brooms if they trespass 1 inch into the other's territory. So it's kind of the human predicament. The heavens have given us something wonderful, but what we do with it is much too human.
And I think you said something that going back to the strong gods that we were talking about that are back, I think you said in there somewhere that the half-known life is belief in kind of the universals that people share, and there's a lot you don't know. The certitudes of faith, where you have no doubts, is where we get into trouble. And that a place like Jerusalem, where the certitudes of faith are stronger there are more cemeteries. I think you said something like that. And they brought to mind Albert Camus' comment about victims and executioners. You know, if the victims become executioners, only innocent or only the dead are innocent. So that certitude about faiths, that's strong gods instead of an openness, is also kind of a fatal thing.
Oh, you just expressed it perfectly, better than I did in the book. Exactly. Yeah. Certitude is where our problems begin.
Yeah.
And openness or humility is where our connections start, which are much more fruitful.
Thank you, Siddharth, Pico, Iyer.
Thank you, Nathan. It's such a delight to talk to you.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardels, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardels, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.